to see if we could try again. So bear with us. We're gonna take a couple minutes to get set up. If you can hear me, if you could click the like button, that would be great. Hey y'all, we're just getting set up. We ran into some technical difficulties in our tag team effort. Galen and I were hoping to be on live together. So just wanted to, take a couple minutes to get set up. If you can hear me, if you could click the like button, that'd be great. And we'll get started here in a couple minutes. All right. Well, as I said before, we're having a few technical difficulties, so we're getting started a little bit late today, but we're glad you're here, and we're excited to talk about living rivers here in a few. I think what we're going to do instead, since we can't seem to get both of us on at the same time, is Galen's going to chat in some questions. I'm going to give some background, and hopefully if you all have questions, that'd be great if you would send them in as well. All right, if you can hear me, could you click the like button so I can see that whoever's out there, that it's actually working this time? All right, well, if Galen's ready, I think we should try to get started. Okay. So I just want to talk a little bit about the work that we do at Guardians in the Rivers program. And I know you've heard Galen and Marlise, both in the Rivers program, talk about the Willamette and the Rio Grande. And I wanted to add a little bit a different perspective. I've been at Guardians for 7 years as the Rivers program director, and I have done a lot of different work that we'd like to just get out there today. So I have a question about why I work on rivers in the American West, and that's a loaded question, but I have always loved rivers. When I was a little girl, I used to always play on rivers, and we spent a lot of time fishing and hiking and falling in rivers, and it just kind of became a part of who I was. So it seemed like something that I cared about, and obviously there are some huge challenges facing rivers. And so as a creature of the West, and especially the desert Southwest, water is life. Rivers are the lifeblood and the arteries of our landscapes, and they provide nourishment to people and wildlife. And so being able to work at the heart of ecosystems is a great privilege, and is really a rewarding path for me going forward. So Guardians has been working on rivers for upwards of 30 years. I have only been a part of it the last decade, but we came to rivers work out of love and outrage, which is something that has happened a lot. What happened in 1996, we're basically a regional organization that worked largely in New Mexico, and we witnessed a tragedy that happened when the Rio Grande was dried by the Middle Rio Grande Conservancy District intentionally to try to divert all the water into its canals with no regard for the endangered species, species of Rio Grande silvery minnow, which had just been listed earlier a couple years before. And so Guardians decided at that point that we couldn't stay silent anymore and that we needed to start working to protect flows in living rivers, and water management changes needed to be made. So in 1996, we started to advocate for protecting a river's right to flow, a river to have a right to its own water, and that that resulted in some litigation that happened in the late 1990s, which is kind of how we got involved in our rivers work on the Rio Grande. We have since expanded our work into the Colorado River Basin, to the Willamette River Basin on the Columbia, or tributary to the Columbia. And we're really excited about doing the work that we've been doing and trying to reform Western water policy across the West. Western water policy was essentially birthed via the mining boom that happened and in the 1800s, and so it became a first come, first serve right, and as a result, there are lots of flaws in the system that don't allow equitable allocation of the water, don't take into consideration a river's right to its own water, and so we've been trying to expose those cracks in the system and try to protect flows in our rivers for people and wildlife, and rivers create amazing corridors and obviously nourish landscapes. So there's a lot of reasons that rivers are worth protecting. If anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to take them. I'm going to give you a few seconds to send them in and I'll see if I can answer. All right. Well, I don't see any questions, but if you have any, please type them in the chat window. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the laws that protect rivers. I think that a lot of people know that Guardians is renowned for protecting landscapes and people and rivers and public health via litigation, and we do that in rivers too. And some of the laws that we use to protect rivers are the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, the Endangered Species Act. Some of these fundamental environmental laws like the Clean Water Act that have been around since about the time that I was born and are really serve as a safety net both for the environment and for public health. So, I'll give you a little summary about what each of these laws does. I don't really want to get into the weeds, but the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act is a really important law in that it protects free-flowing rivers from being dammed and diverted. And so what happens is, for example, some of the most iconic wild and scenic rivers are the Rio Grande, of course. There's a wild and scenic section from the Colorado and New Mexico state line, 75 miles downstream. There's the Rogue River in Oregon, which is a famous wild and scenic protected river. There are also another section of the Rio Grande, wild and scenic river in Big Bend National Park. So there are lots of amazing sections of rivers that are protected. And once a river is protected under the Wild and Scenic River Act, it cannot no longer be dammed. And it has certain values that have to be maintained. So it's a law that is kind of a preemptive law that helps protect rivers. The Endangered Species Act is also a really important law that we use to protect landscapes and river ecosystems. The Endangered Species Act is a way you can get species listed, and you can also protect those species once they're listed. As I mentioned before, in the Rio Grande Basin, you have the Rio Grande silvery minnow, the southwestern willow flycatcher, the yellow-billed cuckoo, some riparian and aquatic species that are not doing well in the Rio Grande, and so they were listed as endangered species and now are being, and now are being protected under the law. And so it requires federal agencies and others to take actions that protect species. Some other examples of threatened and endangered species are salmon and steelhead on the Willamette. There are 4 endangered fish on the Colorado River: the humpback chub, the razorback sucker, the bony tail, and the Colorado pike minnow. These 4 prehistoric fish are really interesting, and the health of the river is really shown by the health of these species. When these species are thriving, it shows that the river is connected, that it has different habitat niches available, it's free flowing, it has dynamic flows. And so species are really a good indicator of how well the health of the river is playing out. So the Endangered Species Act is an incredibly important law to help us make sure that the actual living river system is kept whole. Another really important law that we use in the Rivers program is the Clean Water Act. The Clean Water Act was passed in the 1970s in order to protect rivers from catching on fire, from people dumping sewage and other things into rivers without any consequences. And so it's largely been a law to protect clean water and public health. This law is, it helps us protect rivers in that it keeps them clean. There are also provisions of the Clean Water Act that prevent wetlands and waterways from being filled. So from someone building a house in a floodplain, or filling a wetland to build something, or to create a pond or something. So basically what the Clean Water Act does is it provides some just basic protections. One of the interesting things that you may have heard of in the news recently is the Trump administration has rolled back some pretty significant provisions of not only the Clean Water Act, but also the Endangered Species Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, and over 100 other laws. And these are laws that provide an environmental safety net for people and wildlife and landscapes. And so Guardians and the Rivers program are working to protect and defend against those rollbacks and try to not only restore those laws to the way they were, but also improve them to make sure that we can protect public health and the environment going forward. I'm going to pause right here. Thanks so much for joining us. We're doing Living Rivers Live. If you all have any questions or comments that you'd like to provide, we'd welcome them. I'm going to give you a couple 10, 20, 30 seconds to add some comments or questions in there, and take a quick break. Awesome. I see a couple comments. There's a question from Mark who asks, do rivers have an inherent right to in-stream water, or is it based on other regulations such as the Endangered Species Act? The answer to this is both and. Particular states have laws that protect in-stream flows. I know Colorado has a law, an in-stream flow law that protects certain reaches of in-stream flows. The problem with those laws is that they tend to be not senior water rights, so the water rights are issued in priority, and so the river was never given a right to its water initially, even though it was technically the senior right. And so what the state of Colorado, for example, has done is they issue rights to the river, but they're like they're new rights, so they don't have as much priority, so they don't tend to keep the river as protected as, say, a senior water right would be, a really old water right that would be kept in the river. So that is one way, a state law is one way that in-stream flows are provided. And then there are lots of other creative ways that people have used to protect water in stream. The Endangered Species Act is one way. When agencies are consulting over a species that is listed and they're trying to figure out how the activity can go on while still protecting the species. Sometimes they issue like an in-stream flow or a particular amount of water at a certain location to ensure that that species can survive and go through its life history. And there's also transactions that happen, leases and purchases of water that can be taken from, say, agriculture or industry, and then transferred into a water that's an in-stream flow that gets delivered to a certain location. And so some of our allies like Audubon is doing in-stream flow transfers on the Rio Grande. There are lots of people in other parts of the country that have in-stream flow programs through water leasing, as well as there are regulatory through the Endangered Species Act and other laws that allow in-stream flow. So we really appreciate your question. Thanks so much. Galen wants to know if I can talk more about our work on the Colorado River. Absolutely. The Colorado River is one of those rivers that we hadn't worked a lot on because there are lots of environmental groups and other folks that are working on the Colorado River. It's kind of the darling of the West. And I have a little bit of a bias towards the Rio Grande because that's where I grew up. But the Colorado River is a really important system because it you know, obviously the Colorado River affects 2 countries. It affects 7 states. It provides water for agriculture and communities in the West. The water I drink every day in Denver is from the Colorado River. And so it has some really some big challenges. And also, I think everyone who's been to the Colorado River understands the beauty and the amazing landscape that it has cut, and anyone who's seen the Grand Canyon would attest to the value of the Colorado River just in and of itself. So doing a lot of work to try to protect the flows that are in the river and to prevent additional diversions from the river. The Colorado River is one of the hardest working rivers in the West. It's divided into 2 basins, the upper basin, which includes Colorado area, and then the lower basin is south of Glen Canyon Dam. And so it's been divided. The water has been allocated. The water was allocated in a way that took into account some wet years that have not been seen since and probably will never be seen again. So there's some just structural challenges there that we need to address. And so Guardians and some of our allies like Save the Colorado, Living Rivers or Colorado Riverkeeper, Waterkeeper Alliance, Sierra Club, the Environmental Group, a bunch of other groups around the West have started to form an alliance to challenge new diversion projects that look to take more water out of the Colorado River at this point when there's no more water left to give. There are 2 projects on the Front Range, the Windy Gap Firming Project and the Moffett Collection System Project, which are trans-basin diversions that take water from the Colorado River on the west side of the mountains and takes them through pipelines to the east slope. They want to build some reservoirs on the east slope and then use those to shore up water supplies here in the Front Range. And the need for that water, conservation is starting to, there are lots of conservation options on the Front Range in terms of going to xeric landscaping and using less water. And it's been shown since 2000 that water demands have gone down pretty significantly. And so our hopes are that instead of just looking to the Colorado again and again to satisfy the demands of the Front Range, that we should really be looking at how to quell the demands of the Front Range and let's leave the Colorado River alone. I think if you think about folks in Colorado, I know I live in Colorado. I love Colorado, but I love it for its mountains and its wild spaces, and not for necessarily its green grass. So that's some of the work that we're doing. We're also working to prevent pumped hydro storage projects that have specific and significant environmental impacts. There is one of these such projects that was proposed to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission that would essentially put 2 dams on the Little Colorado River, which if you've never seen that river, it's an incredibly beautiful, like turquoise colored river that runs into the Colorado River in the Grand Canyon. And so these dams would not only divide and change the water quality and the color of the water, but they would also impact the primary spawning grounds for the humpback chub, which is one of those endangered species I spoke about earlier. And this species is a really incredible species. We just actually, we're working on protecting its listing status. It's right now listed as an endangered species, and the federal government has just proposed to reduce its protections and list it instead of as a threatened species. So we provided really extensive comments that hopefully can be shared in the chat so that you can see some of the reasons why the humpback chub really needs to be protected at the highest level, so that these projects will not go through, and that these landscapes, as well as these incredibly prehistoric and interesting species, will not be lost in the process. I'm going to take a quick break just to see if anyone has any additional questions about the Colorado or anything else related to living rivers. See if there are questions here that I missed while I was chatting. Yeah, so before I go, folks want to know what our vision, my vision is for living rivers in the American West. Western rivers are incredibly valuable from obviously our heritage, our families, our culture, as well as from an economic standpoint. And so I think the thing about living rivers that is the way I think we need a change and a new paradigm for how we manage rivers, because I think right now there's a very slim set of those values that we actually talk about. When I think about living rivers, I think about they have the right to flow, they have a right to meander across a floodplain, they have clean water. Living rivers have thriving species, native species that have been here for eons. Living rivers also provide a quality of life for people. They provide clean water for people. They provide native cultures with, the ceremonies and the things that they have done on these lands for centuries. And I think if we think about all of those values of living rivers and start managing rivers to really take into account the past injustices to the river, as well as to vulnerable communities, and try to take the kind of the run off the river, the let's get every last drop out of this river so that we can move forward. I think we've been doing that for a long time. It's been causing some serious environmental problems. It's been causing problems in terms of how much water is available to certain communities. And I think that the way we do that is to think about sharing water, about how we can move forward with living rivers where all of those uses can be managed in a sustainable way. And so that requires mixing it up. It requires changing the entrenched system that allocates water by who got here first, and honoring those other uses. All right, any last questions before we wrap up today? I'd like to just mention that we have a West-wide Living River petition that's going to come out on Friday. We hope that you will keep an eye out for that. If you're on Guardian's email list, you will receive it. If you're not, you can sign up to be a Guardian, to be part of our Living River network. And you'll be able to take action to sign that petition that will hopefully be delivered to decision makers all over the West on rivers and water issues. We will also, so you can take that action once it comes out. If you have any questions, you can go to our website and see what we're working on. And thanks so much for taking time out to join us. We apologize for the technical difficulties at the get-go, and we kind of improvised this one, but I think it went well. So I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day, and Cheers to living rivers.